Yes, so welcome back. I'm delighted to be joined by Jesse Morton, who is a former Al-Qaeda propagandist turned counter-extremist. He founded the very first jihadi online magazine. He's now founded, more recently, after being de-radicalized in prison, an anti-extremist magazine using, I guess, some of the same tools and techniques. So first of all, Jesse, thank you very much for your time. I guess the obvious place to start is, how did you first get involved in kind of radicalismist politics?
I think that we're learning more and more about those that are susceptible to extremism, and more about the correlation between adverse childhood experience and the traumatized state of an individual being able to progress into the simplistic worldview extremists offer recruits. And I think that my case is one that has to therefore start in childhood, where there was a lot of physical abuse in the home that led me to run away at the age of 16 and take to a sort of street life and a street criminality mentality that was very much opposed to the world that I lived in, very willing to tear it down in order to build something up that was more conducive to my own self-interests. And so at the age of 16, running away first to New York City, living on the streets, learning how to peddle drugs, I became embedded in a different social movement, which was the Grateful Dead, a counterculture sort of hippie band that goes around the country and that a lot of people here in the United States sort of live with in order to get off of the map and to provide sustenance that's out of the system, if you will. And one of the ways you provide sustenance through that mechanism is by selling drugs and engaging in very criminal behavior. That led to my incarceration at the age of 18. And the first time I was incarcerated, I had read the autobiography of Malcolm X cover to cover several times. So I like to say that I adopted the interpretation of Islam from Malcolm X, not from the Prophet Muhammad. I wanted to become like Malcolm. His story resonated with me. He was traumatized. He was incarcerated. He found the Nation of Islam, an unorthodox version of Islam, and then became this radical social activist who did not denounce violence per se. And so that appealed to me. And then I started to read Islamic scripture. Shortly before 9/11, due to the fact I was still living the same lifestyle, I was incarcerated again. A day after I converted to Islam officially in Philadelphia, I was arrested in Richmond, Virginia, and I was incarcerated with a veteran of the Afghan-Soviet jihad. And he sort of took me through the Quran, taught me how to pray, taught me the 5 fundamental pillars of Islam, and then told me that my real conversion could come. Told me to go into the shower and wash, and that when I washed every inch of my body, I was essentially washing away all of the sins of my life before Islam, that I would be born new and he would give me a new identity. So they took me out of the shower, they put me on a white sheet, they brought the Quran. All of the Muslims in the cell block came and sat in a circle, and I put my hand on the Quran and I accepted the faith. And then he gave me the name Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. And he told me that Yunus was the one that was swallowed in the whale, Jonah in the Bible, spit back up onto the beach, and then called all of his people to Islam. Abdullah meant that I was always going to be, Abd is slave. Abdullah means slave of Allah. So I was going to be a slave to the God that created me, a very punitive sort of fear-based interpretation of the religion, and that Muhammad was the one that should be emulated. And that was the best name that could be given to mankind. It really motivated me. And then about a week later, while we were praying, a Christian got up in the cell block and was perturbed by the fact that we were calling the Muslim prayer early for the first prayer of the day. He came over and he stood in front of the Moroccan leading the prayer, and he refused to move. The Moroccan got up and fought him. And I simply never had contact with this style of extremism in religion, and I didn't get it. I, of course, was open to rejecting it at first, but he told me about the fact that Muslims are like David battling Goliath, and that the Prophet Muhammad had said that if someone comes and stands in front of the prayer, move them gently with your right hand to get them out of the way, and if they refuse to move, then stand up and fight them, for verily they are a devil. And so here is the reference to Muhammad and the basis that we don't make our own decisions in Islam. We base our decisions on Muhammad and base our decisions on the scholars or the people of knowledge that interpret them. So this was my first incubation into the Salafi sort of perspective. And when I left that situation, I went on to change my life completely and to adopt Islam, which gave me help in prayer, in meditation, and in structure where I previously had none. But I also then witnessed 9/11. And by the time George Bush said, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists," I was so hateful of the country that I was born in, and largely impacted by the trauma that preceded it and my lack of feeling like I belonged to a society that I felt had betrayed me by not protecting me. I realize this now. That I adopted the mentality and started to search online in my own time for the narratives of Al-Qaeda. That led me to become a preacher on the streets of Harlem, New York, first calling people to oppose the Iraq War, calling them to adopt Islam and return to their true religion, and then going forth to meet members of the Al-Muhajirun network that were operating in New York City, having a white, blonde, blue-eyed adherent was something that was very powerful for their narrative to hold me up. I've always been articulate, a fast learner. So I climbed the ranks, became a preacher, developed relationships with all of the key ideologues of the movement, whether it was Omar Bakri Mohammed, Anjem Choudhury, Abdullah Faisal, Anwar al-Awlaki, and started to ascend the ranks and become a pretty prominent English language Al-Qaeda supporter.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned Al-Madroon. I mean, obviously they've now been banned in the UK. I presume it's the same in the US, as have kind of several successful organisations. But I mean, I remember it probably would have been around 2008 or something. I mean, I saw a bunch of them outside the British Parliament with signs saying kind of freedom go to hell, democracy go to hell. And I just thought, these people are a joke. I just didn't take it seriously. And I think that a lot of the political class, certainly in Britain, probably in America as well, didn't take groups like this seriously. They kind of thought, they're just wackos with, they're the equivalent of a guy with a Bible shouting in the street. I mean, why do you think it is? Why do you think we failed to appreciate just how dangerous these groups were?
I think that for a number of reasons. I think that at the time we didn't realize that we were going to be waging a generational war against extremism.
Yeah.
I think that we valued very much the idea of free speech and free expression in our societies, and that though they espoused a fearful and a fear-mongering narrative, we felt like it was better to not interfere with that narrative because it was only a fringe segment of our society. And then with the problems that were created with the perceptions that the Iraq War was an unjust invasion, and the resonance and the ability for the Iraqi resistance to such an occupation and invasion to turn into a jihadist mindset allowed jihadists to present themselves as if they were a global counter-capitalist insurgency, if you will, that had a sticky, coherent worldview that people like Al-Muhajirun were able to formulate in a way that was appropriate for a Western audience. And that's essentially what we did when I started my own organization and broke from Al-Muhajirun. I thought that Al-Muhajirun was a little too soft in not openly advocating for the type of ideology that Al-Qaeda was espousing. Another preacher that didn't necessarily think Al-Muhajirun was legitimate, thought that they were not far enough into extremism. Abdullah Faisal, who lived in the UK for many, many years, was in Belmarsh prison when I met him and started to correspond with him, who had radicalized people like Richard Reed, Jermaine Lindsay, and others, 7/7 bomber, 9/11 bomber, or attempted 9/11 bomber. And he was about to be released from prison. And so what we set out to do was to create a narrative that unabashedly supported Al-Qaeda's views. We did that in conjunction with Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan. And so the American system, where they were laughing at us being a very fringe movement and an offshoot of Al-Muhajirun, and telling us that the differentiation of the American Muslim community, they are more educated, they are more economically advantaged, and they assimilate better, meant that they would be non-susceptible to the jihadist ideology. We proved that those variables have very little to do with susceptibility, and that it is actually the power of the ideology. And so to answer, you can go back to your original question. I think that we have lost an appreciation for the value or the role that ideas play in crafting societies and in crafting communities. And we didn't recognize that addressing the ideas early, rather than just letting them be espoused without interference, could create a sort of metastasizing effect that would create the problem that we haven't been able to deal with effectively for, over a decade, since it sort of started to ascend and gain more adherence and popularity.
Yeah. And when they were operating openly, Anjem Chowdhury, Al Majroud, they used to say, at least publicly, that they thought there was a covenant of security, I think, between Muslims living in Western countries um, and the Western countries themselves, and that hadn't yet been broken. And that was why, that's why they stopped short of publicly endorsing violence. I mean, do you think that was a complete con? Did they actually believe that? Or was that just to stop them being made illegal? Or was that kind of like a genuine belief?
It was a genuine belief to a degree. It's somewhere in between. So you have interviews where Omar Bakri Mohammed felt like his son was under danger from the United Kingdom after he moved back to Lebanon after the proscription of al-Muhajirun. And he espoused himself then as one of the ones that could be the greatest deterrent from the commission of terrorism, because he adopted this position of the covenant of security. But he threatened to remove it if the UK harmed his son in any way. And in private discussion, it was well known in the Al-Muhajirun movement and amongst the conversation, particularly amongst the leadership, that what was espoused publicly wasn't necessarily what the group believed in, but that the idea, there's a statement from the Prophet Muhammad that jihad is deception, right? And so that was one of the criticisms that my organization had, was that, no, when it comes to belief and issues that interfere with belief and that are very primary beliefs, such as the covenant of security, you have to tell the truth about what you really feel. And so while they were trying to strategically promote this view, we were working behind closed doors to pull some of their own adherents away from that stream of thinking and to embed them in Abdullah Faisal's message, which was that there is no covenant of security. And you can see the impact of that argumentation during that era when you look at cases like Usman Khan, who was part of this this sort of cell that created a series of attacks, his being one of them, but also that tried to set off a bomb in the London Stock Exchange. They really literally were the core group of al-Muhajirun that had migrated and navigated more towards our side of things. And a lot of that discussion ended up being part of the reason that they took the next step to violent extremism. And so it is true to a degree that the public espousal of support for the covenant of security did and have a real world impact of deterring adherents in the al-Muhajirun movement from translating into violence. But then in a later era, you have to realize that once you support a caliph, as Anjem and all of those people did, then you adopt and you have to go along with the line and the espoused ideology of the one that you have claimed allegiance to. And ISIS's calls were to carry out attacks at home. And so therefore, strategically, they may have at that point during the era of ISIS and not Al-Qaeda, continued to espouse support and endorsement of this covenant of security, but it wasn't binding on any of them, and they all knew that because they all secretly and clandestinely took the oath of allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
Yeah. I mean, when you were trying to persuade people from Al-Madrun to join your group, or indeed kind of Muslims in general, to your worldview, what would be the main arguments you used? What did you find most persuasive?
So it's very important to understand the methodology of extremist recruitment, because everything that we do to counter it is actually opposite-ended. So we didn't target rational argumentation, not in the first stage. What we targeted was emotional and spiritual communication, short messages. It was like Al-Qaeda on Madison Avenue, if you will. Branded, real quick, combative conversation with in-group and other groups outside of ourselves that made us look like we were standing up to defend people, but really short, targeted, emotional and spiritual messaging. What that does is, even from a neuroscientific standpoint, it sets off all kinds of releases in the brain of those that are traumatized in particular, where oxytocin and cortisol are released and they identify this bonding with the group. And then when they go into what we offered was basically a one-stop shop for 24/7 communication, where you had the emotional messages alongside of interactivity. You could log in 5 days a week to live conversations with some of the biggest radical preachers of the era. And that's where you would become informed at the level of rationality and slowly over time adopt beliefs that are running counter to human nature. At first you reject them, but when you think that the extremism is justified because you're constantly seeing pictures of dead Muslims, you're constantly absorbing a narrative that the West is at war with Islam, and you're constantly absorbing a black and a white, very simplistic worldview, then it allows you to cement commitment to the ideology. And as you're learning, you're interacting with others. And so essentially your identity becomes part of the movement. It becomes part of the collective. It's identity fusion. We intuitively then knew that. And we knew that the long diatribes of Al-Qaeda ideologues in quote unquote caves in Afghanistan weren't going to work with a Western youth audience. And so what we did was we would take the narrative and we learned their ideology and their espousal, but we made it like the English language jihadi magazines. We made it, you know, really image laden, very powerful, less text, more picture, right? And then those magazines and the videos that were associated with them, and then the replication of the jihadist videos of them, you know, performing violence in action would facilitate a connection back to the core hub site and to the lectures and to the recordings and to where you had a 24/7 echo chamber where the only thing you absorbed and the only place you took your news from was our outlet. And that's really the process now on the other side of things when we talk about counter messaging. We communicate with the rational mind first and try to refute the other, rather than posing an alternative that appeals to the emotions, connects to refutation material, and then provides another alternative worldview, but also is connected to a movement that can provide real world interaction and group belonging that resonates with those that would be susceptible to extremism in the first place. And that's what the work that I'm doing now is basically trying to achieve. It's basically a reverse engineering process of what I learned as an extremist, combined with the broader awarenesses of how that attaches itself to scientific gains that we've made in the realm of neuroscience, trauma-informed care, and other new ways of looking at the complexities of radicalization into violent extremism.
I mean, obviously, both ISIS and Al-Qaeda now produce kind of high-quality, glossy magazines, you know, very well done video, very professionally produced, and especially during kind of the heyday of ISIS, in you know multiple languages. I mean, do you think extremists have got better at understanding this stuff? I mean, you say that kind of you know the message from the cave in Afghanistan wasn't working. They got much better interaction with the internet and kind of appealing to the new generation.
Yes, indeed. I mean, through trial and error in one, it's natural and we could expect it. But there is a framework in Islam and in the Quran and the way that the extremists espouse it that, for example, whereas most Muslims benefit in a spiritual sense from a statement of the Prophet Muhammad, he says that there's a piece of flesh in the body. If it is pure, then the body is pure, right? And then he says, it is the heart. Right? So the idea of that is that if you cleanse your heart and you're spiritual, then your mind will follow and your body will follow, for most Muslims. Now, for extremists, that means something very differently. That means that you have to have proper belief in the heart before the limbs and the mind can follow suit. And so they know that rather than target here, the brain, you target the heart intuitively. And there's many different supporting evidences for that. And so when you start to get into the ideology and the doctrine, it intuitively sort of concentrates, because it's spiritual and because it has a religious rule following sort of fundamentalism behind it, it knows that it needs to appeal. And through trial and error, you figure out what appeals, right? You can simply watch the metrics. And it's fascinating to see that back in the day when we could rock on YouTube openly, you could see that the stuff that was substantive would have, 500, 1,000 views. The stuff that was emotional would have 10,000, 100,000 views, right? And so we learned by doing what we would do is we would take the releases that were on the jihadist forums in Arabic, right? And they would be like an hour and a half long of some martyr that blew himself up in Iraq, in a martyrdom operation. But there'd be like 30-second, 45-second clips. So I think we realized, again, intuitively that the attention spans were getting shorter because of social media. So we'd grab that really high impact, exciting clip, isolate it, translate it with subtitles, right? And simply upload it. Those things would get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views. So we learned very clearly that oh, what appeals is violence first. Violence first gets the person, opens them up because it's exciting and they want to find out more. And then in the comment section and in the sort of postings, you could get the website. So you'd see the video, you'd click on the website, all of a sudden you'd be like, here's some Muslim brothers, doing good work. And for those that were open and susceptible, they would migrate in the same ways that I mentioned in the previous question. So it's a combination of learning by doing and the power of the ideology, the power of religion, essentially.
I mean, it's really interesting that you're able to operate openly on YouTube. I mean, do you think there was a lot of naivety amongst social media platforms? Did they just not know what you were doing, or just not care? What do you think was going on?
The decisions and the incentives of social media companies at that time were profit. And so the problem was, for example, when Roshan Chowdhury, who stabbed British MP Stephen Timms on our college campus in 2009 or 2010, I want to say, and ultimately was given a life sentence. The British police asked her, how did you radicalize? You had no in-person contact with anyone from Al-Muhajirun, anyone from an extremist movement. She said, I radicalized by myself in isolation. I would listen to the lectures of Anwar al-Awlaki and watch revolutionmuslim.com, my organization. So this really sent waves through British society, where now they recognized the power of social media in the radicalization process, that it could even impact and influence people that had no contact with any real world extremist. They called for YouTube to take down the content that was associated with my organization and to take Anwar al-Awlaki offline. Now, the problem with the decision-making inside of the social media companies is if they can't uphold the perception that they are in absolute promotion of free expression and free speech, right? Looking at themselves as one of the things that made them so popular was the power of decentralized media. And they didn't want to impact the public's perception, because they know that, other platforms can come up, and immediately, if they preserve such notions, people might migrate and they lose massive revenue. If 1 million, 2 million people even, migrate, that's a major loss of revenue. And so they were mostly concerned about that. It took until like last year, when an organization that I work with, the Counter-Extremism Project, spent 5-6 years lobbying for YouTube to take down Anwar al-Awlaki's videos. It took until last year until they finally adhered to that. And there's, innumerable examples of that. They're under pressure now and they're doing quote unquote better, but the way that they've gone about it and the delay might make it so that had they done it earlier, takedown of content would have worked. But now that people are already radicalized, and there's other platforms, taking down content now essentially makes the problem worse, because it pushes people to darknet platforms where it's harder to monitor and surveillance them, and it's harder to understand what's going on. And this has been the problem of countering extremism in the era of since the war on terror started, is that we're always applying solutions that have taken way too long to be identified and documented with evidence, and we're applying them to a context that's already altered and already shifted, and thereby oftentimes violating the first principle of any human intervention, which is do no harm. A lot of times we are making the problem worse by what we're doing, because there's a delay in our ability to adapt to extremist techniques, strategies, and messages. My organization is trying to develop a system that is more nimble, more quick, and that can identify these alterations early and that can proactively oppose them. And we've been effective in developing mechanisms to do that, but we're going to really have to pay attention, because things are mutating much faster than they used to, and radicalization processes are growing much shorter than they used to. And so we're looking at a mountain of problems ahead that, if we continue to have these types of delays in action, are going to hinder our ability to counter it. And they're at a stage where, I won't elaborate for time, but Osama bin Laden was waging a war of attrition. He didn't see himself as being able to combat us militarily. He saw himself as being able to induce a collapse from within our societies. The fact that we're now waging a struggle against internal, far right-wing extremism, and that is facilitating polarization and adopting indicators that we're transitioning into a level of far leftist extremism, suggests that that fragmentation and that ability to render democracies inoperable and point out their hypocrisies, as far as jihadists are concerned, they are one economic downturn away from being able to ascend and take over the entire region.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you mentioned far-right extremism. Obviously, there's a kind of a big argument that far-right extremism and Islamist extremism complement each other, but that they both use each other for their propaganda. I mean, do you think far-right extremism maybe is where Islamism was, say, 15, 20, 30 years ago? I mean, there seems to be like a growing number of kind of massacres carried out by white nationalist groups, and obviously their kind of political fronts in certain parts of the world, certainly in certain parts of Europe, are getting more prominent. I mean, do you think is this a rising ideology following a trajectory that you recognise?
Yeah, I do think that because the primary concentration was on the jihadists for many years, that a lot of the ways that jihadists adapted are now having to be done by the far right, but that's just out of convenience. I think that the fact that we have to deal with that situation is largely a consequence of the socioeconomic impact of the war on terror, the allocation of resource, and the ability for jihadists to utilize their narratives to discredit this idea that democratic societies support human rights and apply them across the board. And with a downturn in economic situation, you oftentimes have what Eric Hoffer, a competent philosopher that wrote a book on social movements called The True Believer. You often have a phenomenon of new poor. And new poor are different than old poor because old poor are used to living in conditions of poverty and they have accepted it. That's their world. New poor knows something different. And that, combined with the impact of interconnectivity, of globalization, and the idea that we were sort of leveling things off, but watching your quality of life decrease, has made a lot of people support this sort of ethnocentrism that drives the far right. The problem that I see is that when you're talking about radicalization in the West amongst Muslims, in most countries they represent, less than 5% of the population, and typically less than 2.5% of the population in Western countries. So you're talking about messaging that is, going to resonate with a very small subset of society. So it doesn't pose a danger to the society itself. It can facilitate the long-term goals of jihadists that are operating from abroad. But when we talk about the far right-wing threat, we talk about an appealability to a very large sector of our society. And the fact that the far right was essentially birthed by the combating of jihadism is evident in the evolution of such coming into Britain primarily. The English Defense League and other organizations were largely reactions to the presence of al-Muhajirun. Right. And then you had in France this theory of the great replacement, which now has mutated and become the theory that was not only adopted, by the Christchurch shooter, but was also then resonated in regard to an American context in El Paso with an attack that we witnessed. And so the same, and if you break down the key ideological principles of the far right and jihadists, they also run congruent. Because the jihadists, they want to return to a pristine utopian past that is not reality, but that resonates and seems powerful. So you're fighting to return to an old traditional way of life. You're offering a solution for the far right. It's the ethno-state. For the jihadists, it's the caliphate. And then you're rejecting multiculturalism because of the in-group, out-group bias. So those three fundamental principles translate into a coherent ideology when synthesized that show not just a grievance, but also offer potential adherents a solution. And when it seems like our mainstream politicians and mainstream peoples don't offer much of a solution that will fulfill the needs of the quote unquote new poor, then you see youth frustrated and angry, mobilized for radical social movement activism. And at the same time, depending upon where they come from, whether they're the privileged class and they become typically far leftists or anti-fascists, or whether they're the underprivileged class and they become sort of seeking for far right-wing ideologies, now they're going against each other and the conditions are ripe for not necessarily civil war, but for malfunction. And attacking the roots of the system itself. So we're in a very dangerous stage of the process.
I mean, do you think it'd be fair to say that the biggest threat that Islamist fundamentalism poses to the West is essentially in the reaction? Is that it provides propaganda for and support for far-right groups, which, I mean, as you say, obviously, Muslim populations are relatively low, whereas far-right groups could potentially take over Western countries. They potentially have the support base to do so. I mean, do you think that's the case? Do you think the biggest threat that a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda poses to the West isn't so much in the bombs they set off, but rather in the threat that they pose to the liberal democratic system via some kind of ultra-reactionary fight back?
Yeah. As has been said, to paraphrase a scholar of terrorism studies, terrorists don't care about the number of people killed, they care about the number of people watching.
Yeah.
And so it is violence or propaganda of the deed, if you will, which goes all the way back to anarchism and the foundations of modern terrorism. And so, yes, the idea is that through wanton violence to create an overreaction that would create oppression or perceptions of oppression against Muslims on domestic shores, and also set forth the conditions for an animosity, an anti-Islamic animosity, that can fuel that victimization discourse, but also then be transitioned into feeling like the state is not doing enough to counter the problem. And you see that in Germany, in France, in UK, everywhere. That sort of narrative has worked incredibly well. And we knew coherently and consciously that that was part of our primary purpose, was to create hyperpolarization at home that would render democracy completely inoperable and allow us to point constantly to the fact that Muslims were under threat, to highlight people burning Qur'ans or taking those most reactionary positions, representing them as if they were representative of the entire population, thereby using it to radicalize and recruit others, but also utilizing it to strategically create rifts between the mainstream and the fringes of society, knowing that that intersection and that reciprocal radicalization, if you will, would potentially fulfill and expedite the long-term goal of waging a war of attrition that would essentially allow Western societies to bankrupt themselves, first financially and then politically.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, did you almost see groups like, the English Defence League or Generation Identity almost as kind of your useful idiots?
Yes.
They were reacting exactly how you wanted them to.
Yes, Tommy Robinson and the English Defence League in particular arose largely as a result. For example, I work with a former right-wing extremist now, a beautiful man called Ivan Humble. And Ivan went to an al-Muhajirun rally where they were calling British troops returning from abroad, from Afghanistan, terrorists, while they were holding a parade that was supportive of their sacrifice. Anjem knew full well that that was going to have an impact. In fact, on a phone call before they organized the protest, he reported that it was, they expected far right-wing extremists to show up to counter them. And he was very, very, very excited because he knew that the police in a democratic society had to protect them. And he knew exactly what would happen with regard to the residents, that they'll show their true colors, as he would put it. See, he himself believed that every Western Kafir or non-believer held in their hearts resentment against Muslims that practiced the true interpretation of Islam, whether they were from the right or the left. His idea was, if we make them come out and show it, then we're beautifully positioned to allow our ideas to resonate.
That's really interesting. I mean, a lot of the things Al-Madjoun did before they were banned were sector organisations. Things like burning poppies on Remembrance Sunday. I think you mentioned the countering in Luton, the Royal Anglian Regiment. I mean, threatening to protest in Wootton Bassett, which is where British soldiers who were killed in Afghanistan used to be brought home via. I mean, it seemed to be incredibly incendiary and provocative, and always designed to kind of stir up the right-wing tabloids, to get the kind of the Daily Mail front page. But that was actually a conscious strategy. It wasn't that they just happened to hate poppies. They were really thinking this through and thought, how can we provoke such a strong reaction that it could start to undermine democratic institutions?
Yes, we consciously knew that some of the things we espoused in public were not necessarily sane. but we definitely knew that it was easy to bait the mainstream media. And I think the best person that has ever done that is Engin Chowdhury. I mean, if people and the public knew the conversations that were had, where you're literally laughing at the front page press, knowing that like millions of people are going to be enraged, which is great, and that another 100 people are going to come into the movement because they look at you as someone who's standing up to grievances that they might experience. It literally was a situation where there was a high degree of manipulation, not just of the mainstream media, but with counterterrorism academics. Over time, got very able to go into, back then it was blogs, counterterrorism blogs, and to challenge their beliefs, to show that they had a very limited understanding of Islam and to mock them, and then to bump those conversations back into jihadist forums, which would be quite humorous and cement that fused identity that I was talking about. So at every sector, there was an awareness that if you provoke and bait, you can manipulate them to overreact, or at least to publicize your cause. And again, if the cause of terrorists is not how many people are dead, but how many people are watching, it was a very effective mechanism of creating, just a frenzy around the existence of al-Muhajirun by the time it was over in the UK. And at every step of the way, conducting policy and practice that by the time it was implemented was being applied to an altered state of affairs and actually continuously making things worse, until I think, most recently, whether it's a result of ISIS losing territorial control abroad or a result of finally getting tough on this movement, we'll never know. It's probably a combination of the factors. But now I think that we have to keep our eye on the ball, if you will, with regard to jihadism. There's many indications that it could resurrect itself at any given moment, and that perhaps some of the things that are going on in our societies and the conditions of uncertainty associated with COVID, and now the radical social movement protests that are arising from people being cooped up, frustrated, and now looking at economic downturn again, we're going to have to learn how to understand those interrelationships between different extremisms. And we are living in an age of intersectional extremism. And it takes a great degree of complexity and understanding and thinking about how you can elevate above that and get the populace to attack problems and grievances that are very real, but to attack them at a level of consciousness that's higher than that which creates them. And so when we look at having an opposition to a statue or something like this that's sort of race-based and seems to be attached to the death of an individual abroad, this Black Lives Matter phenomenon that is now triggering global resentment, I don't think it's very much about the situation, because cases like that have been, documented for a long time. I think the conditions in which that can trigger a riot-like reaction are very dangerous now. And I also think that the problem is that you have a form of radicalization that is wanting to tear everything down but poses no solution. Jihadists pose a solution. The far right poses a solution. The absurdity of the recent bait of rioting and protesting doesn't offer much of a solution than to destroy capitalism, to destroy the nation state, to utterly just tear everything down. And in a sense, the mainstream has accepted it because it seems to be opposed to racism. But really, if you look at the many of the people that are pushing for this and their ideologies, the objective is actually much deeper than that. It's to tear down the quote unquote imperialism and offer no alternative for going forward. That's only going to foment further radicalization amongst the far right, and the jihadists will sit back and they'll exploit the void in the Middle East. They'll create another sanctuary, maybe not a khilafah, maybe not an Islamic state, but they'll have spaces where Muslims in the West can migrate to again. And then you'll see the same phenomenon unfold, where you'll be messaging in a very different direction and trying to exploit the new circumstances. So we're going to have to really understand the intersectionality between the left, the right, the radical sort of transition of both those parties, the way that they will intersect with each other, the way that jihadism will plan to have a midterm benefit from that, and how we can get our own selves out of that sort of knee-jerk tribalism of, I might be opposed to Boris Johnson, I might be opposed to Donald Trump, but in turn, if I'm not posing solutions that are elevated and that are at a higher order of consciousness. I actually could be thinking that I'm doing good deed, good work, and actually be making the problem worse as well. So, complicated scenario.
I mean, we were discussing before we went live the situation in America, which obviously is quite tense right now. I mean, do you think the combination of obviously existing far-right extremism, a kind of growing radicalization of the left, and a president who seems to hold basic liberal democratic values in a certain level of contempt, I mean, do you think there's an active threat to the American Republic, to American democracy?
Well, I'm not so. I think there's an overemphasis on the role that Donald Trump plays in that. I myself don't really identify with either the right or the left. I hold, when it comes to policy, very different perspectives on very different issues. But I think that the polarization doesn't start there. I do think that really, if we want to be honest, it's partially racially motivated by the 8 years that we had under Barack Obama. But I don't think that we're dealing with white supremacist movements. I think we're dealing largely at the mass base with white nationalist movements, and that there's a distinction between white nationalism and white supremacy. And I think it's largely a consequence of the way we dealt with the previous Great Recession in 2008. And so I think we need to look broader at economic causality. And I do think that the policies of the left, where the idea was there was a subprime mortgage crisis that trickled into threatening capitalism back then, and the idea was, how do we save the people? And the policy was, we bail out Wall Street. And we let people get evicted from their homes. And now we've created mechanisms in the United States where, for example, for people to get Obamacare, and for companies to have to pay for their care, you have to work more than 30 hours a week. So companies now have transitioned to a service economy which provides no dignity to people that are working, and that is hard to enter into, where they keep those hours low. And so as a consequence, you have a lot of people trying to make ends meet with, menial sort of less than 30-hour-a-week jobs as a barista at Starbucks, so to say. Now, you can't have a family on that income. You can't have an independent housing situation where you're healthy and secure. You have to live with roommates. And those are the real conditions and causality of what made us susceptible to the election of Donald Trump, which shocked the world, but was an indicator of populism and support for populism. And the same thing is largely true in the UK as well. So this is not about our leaders. This is about the condition of our people. The way that the leaders can resolve the issue is not to get over partisanship, because that's impossible at this point. It is to think about the relationships between radicalization and extremism and the underlying root causes, primarily economic inequality, wealth discrepancy, and the fact that we are in so many ways living where there is two different ways of life, where there's the way that the elite and the top 10%, like Bernie Sanders puts it, have everything and live in a very different state of affairs and very heightened states of security, and where the lower classes are working paycheck to paycheck, couldn't attend a funeral in California if a loved one died, for example, like 80% of them wouldn't have the savings to do so. And all of the economic statistics, which are going to enhance, right, because of the consequences of COVID, I think we have to concentrate on that space and its intersection with how it creates culture. And when we talk about worrying about the polarization created by a narrative of a president, we don't look at the role that we've all played in it, in accepting certain things that have created the conditions that precede the election of Trump, that made the election of Trump possible, right? And that we really do need to think about not addressing the symptom of the disease, but the underlying trauma, if you would track it against my personal narrative, rather than thinking it was just the extremism and being predisposed to accept the message because of X, Y, or Z, rather than realizing that we are basically at a collective level living in states of uncertainty that are associated with what might be called a global case of PTSD. And in order to address trauma, we know that trauma has impact going forward, and it has impact that manifests itself in all sorts of life areas, including addiction. And addiction can be substituted with an ideology. Ideologies can function like addictions. And so we have to get back to the root of the problem, which is creating societies that are facilitating safety and security and feelings of such. from amongst our population. So things like preschool that induces early critical thinking might not be directly correlated in the minds of most with regard to being able to address violent extremism, but in fact may very well over time become serious indicators of those that don't go on to become extremists and that can present worldviews and alternative worldviews that are complex level that resonate with the masses that are above and beyond with regard to the level of consciousness they espouse.
I mean, just one final question. Obviously, right across the West, there is a big debate about how to handle ISIS returnees. So, you know, it's kind of 800 from the UK, 1,600 from France, who went to join ISIS. Some of whom now want to come back now the caliphate's collapsed. I mean, in the UK today, for example, yeah, you may have heard that the Shamima Begum case is going to court, and she's trying to challenge her exclusion from the UK. And she wants to come back to the UK and then challenge her being stripped of British citizenship. I mean, do you think these people can safely be reintegrated into Western societies? I mean, how much of a threat do you think they pose?
I think the overwhelming majority could certainly and probably have learned that the state of affairs that they went into was based upon a wrong and coherent understanding. And for the overwhelming majority, their reintegration would probably be quite natural. However, the problem that you have when you're a government is you realize the resounding impact of a single terrorist event, right? Political consequences, economic consequences, and others. It also doesn't make much sense to consider people that have renounced their citizenship and essentially joined a proto-state to bring them back. It's very hard for people to get their mind around that. If they hated us, why would we want them to return home? And I get that. But again, I think that perception misses out on the big picture, because essentially by letting those people sit there, you are saying that international law, which requires us to repatriate bring back citizens that have been charged or that have committed crimes abroad or that have committed crimes here, is something that is keeping the system together. In a sense, it's a byproduct of what we would consider the post-World War II liberal order, and this idea that we could create relationships between nation states that would be designed for the protection of the rights of the citizen. When jihadists can point to that as, yes, those principles of liberalism apply, but not when it comes to Muslims, it's a great recruitment tool. ISIS boards are full of documentation of these women lingering in Al-Hawd but holding on to their religion. We need to liberate the prisoner. One of the primary narratives right now is that. Now, if you bring them back, the good thing is if they go through a process of transformation, then you have some of the greatest voices against future extremism, right? And so that's the value of the transformative narrative of people like myself. So there's a value there. The problem is if a single case goes wrong, it tends to cause much more harm than good with regard to the long-term impact. So you have situations like, the notion of de-radicalization, the notion that the UK is developing programs that are effectively reintegrating people. There's no problem. Several years seems like there's gains, but they're one isolated case. Usman Khan comes home. He's on his way to a de-radicalization conference and then in turn kills and commits violence. Those are the things that governments are worried about. So I think it's creating mechanisms that properly understand how to do de-radicalization and promote reintegration, but also utilize the processes associated with that, whether they start in prison and continue into the reintegration process, using that awareness to sort of understand that there also has to be a component of it that's based on monitoring, right? And based on protecting the public and doing a more effective job of that. That's a complicated process. It's one that we are actively, sort of pursuing both here in the United States and trying to have an impact so that people can listen to some of our ideas over there as well, whether that comes to foreign terrorist fighter returnees or whether that comes to those that have been, locked up for domestic terrorism related cases. We are definitely going to have to realize that even though that's a very small number of people, comparatively speaking, how we deal with that population has a broader impact on the state of affairs going forward. And I think it's a key issue that we're not going to talk about much in lieu of all the other things that are happening, but that we also need to be paying attention to as more far right-wing extremists get locked up, as future jihadists get out of prison, and thinking about how that criminal system can both be an incubator for radicalization and a facilitator of violent extremist attacks upon re-entry into society.
It's been a real pleasure. It's really interesting. So thank you so much for your time. I mean, best of luck with all your work with parallel networks. I'll include like a link to your website in the description, and I'll try and embed one in the article as well. But say thank you very much. I'm very grateful.
Yeah, very good. Nice to talk with you. Take care.